Today we're going to be talking about app routing within a Polymer single-page application. Originally this video was going to be on deploying a Firebase application, but over the past week I've been asked about 3 times now how routing works and how to implement app routing and navigation within a Polymer application. So I figured this week I'd focus on that. Next week I'll go ahead and follow up with the Firebase deployment stuff. You'll notice throughout this app I am using Firebase specifically for my authentication, and you'll notice that in the header section that I built out. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. Before we get into the code that I'm using for routing within my application, I wanted to talk briefly about the changes I've made to the folder structure from the default starter kit. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, and you'll see that the main changes that I've made here is actually to the source folder. There's also a functions folder, which is part of the Firebase functions, which I'll be using later on, but for now you can more or less ignore it. There's some extra configuration as well, but again, that's all associated with Firebase, and I'll talk more on that at a later point in time. For now, we're going to go ahead and focus on the source folder. I like to keep all of my theme files separate, and you'll see that I built these out into some basic theming. All my pages I keep at the top level within a pages folder, and then all of my elements I keep separate for them as well. I find this the easiest for navigation. Obviously, if you start getting extreme amounts of elements all associated with the same thing, it would make sense to go ahead and dump another folder within your elements structure for grouping, which I may do later on. I haven't really thought out everything that's going to go into this application yet. But for now, I'm going to go ahead and keep everything at the top level. The only important part that we have here is the source folder itself. As long as all of your source is within your source folder, that's going to save you a lot of headaches in the long run when it comes to configurations for deploying your application. We're going to start off by opening up our elements folder and taking a look at our pages element. And let me transition back over to the main screen for that one, and you'll see here all the code that's associated with it. To start this element, I actually took the routing implementation that existed within the starter kit and just moved it here to start things off. I went ahead and changed all of my pages and dropped them within my DOM module for my lazy imports. And I moved over to the lazy imports mixin so that I could use them as groups, just to make the naming a little bit easier and to reduce the logic associated with importing a little bit. For anyone that's using a Polymer 1 application, there is a behavior instead of a mixin. The mixin was actually only merged relatively recently. Again, we're still using iron pages, and we're going to need to access the application app route to be able to navigate around between our different elements. There's not a lot that needs to be done as far as the styling standpoint goes, but we do need to make sure to import our root path. This is needed, especially specifically within Polymer 2 applications, for handling how we route within the application, especially if you're using applications that are not on the root directory of your server. And you can just change root path and everything will be able to route to that new sub route on your server instead. And you'll see that pattern used everywhere that we're dealing with routing. So it gets passed into all of our pages down here, as well as used to map our pattern within the app route. Again, this will look very similar. You just name each of your routes. I like to give them a label. This is actually used for my navigation later. I'm also using this little test section here to show authenticated within the navigation section. And then I also use title, and you'll see the logic associated with title down below. But as before, you just set up your iron pages, link it to your pages, or to your selected page, and then pop in all of your different pages down here. Each of these should be mapped to one of your lazy import groups up above. And you'll notice that the name for these match 1-to-1 for a name up above. That's how we're handling the importing within the element. If we go ahead and scroll down, you'll see just a basic element. I go ahead and import the lazy imports mixin. The next section here is I have an observer on page change. Page is actually not bound anywhere as far as being set. It's being set explicitly in one of our functions down below. And then I'm using pages here. You'll notice up above that I had items equals pages, and I'm using it as a two-way binding. Pages is never actually set in here. It's never passed down, or it should never be passed down. It's actually generated from Iron Pages and passed up. I use this within the navigation as well. I have a couple internal properties that I use for my routing. You'll notice this. This may have actually been fixed by now. I need to take a look at it, but I haven't yet. As of when I last built a router, it was still an issue, and you had to manually include it in every single route instead of being able to use the route path attribute directly. Here's another binding we have on route data. This is actually how we're setting our page attribute up above. Whenever the page changes in our route data, we go ahead and bind it to the page. And let's jump down to that function next. So this is our page change logic. We go ahead and map the page to home if no page is provided. We need to do a lookup to make sure that that element exists within the scope of this page. We're not trying to import random things that don't actually exist. If it doesn't, we're going to go ahead and show the 404 page, which is just setting the route page to 404. And then we want to jump out of this because this change down here will trigger to rerun this logic, so we don't want to import it twice or even attempt to import it twice. Next, we're going to go ahead and use the import lazy group function to import our page. And again, the page is a one-to-one mapping between the name of the page in Iron Pages and the group name so that we can import directly. Next, I go ahead and use the or set the page, which is how we update the other binding that we have up above, which will trigger our page change, which we'll get to in a second. But then I set the document title. So for any page, or for every page, it starts off with my name, just because I'm building a portfolio application here, which at one point will have a blog, and I'll start posting these kinds of things on that blog as well. But then we're going to go ahead and grab our element, and if it has a title attribute, we'll use that. Otherwise, we'll use the label attribute, and this is what we saw above. I go ahead and call it title here, and then I append it using the bar syntax to the end of it. This is an ES6 string literal, so we can just reference that object directly within the curly braces, or that attribute. Then we always, as always, have to fail back to something. So if this fails out, this then statement runs into an issue, or import lazy group doesn't have anything to import, it'll go ahead and show the 404 page. We need to make sure to bind on this because the scoping changes for this function when it's being used in this way. The other way to get around this is to create an arrow function within here, but I just wanted to reference it directly, so I didn't. Which again will just route us back to the 404 page and retrigger this logic. So I mentioned on page change, we'll go ahead and take a look at that function now. What we're going to do is first check to make sure that the page is not equal to route data.page. Then we'll update route data.page. The main priority for this function is actually if we change the page from outside of this element, it needs to propagate down into our route data's page so that it updates the bindings and will update our URL and then refetch the new page. These changes are specifically needed for our navigation and not really anything else. So now that we've handled our app pages, we're going to go ahead and switch over to the navigation section next. And again, as you saw in most of the sections that were previously there, we actually created a lot of things and set them up specifically for handling the navigation. So first off, we don't really need to import anything extra here. I'm importing Firebase Auth because, again, I'm using Firebase for my authentication, which I'll go into more details later. The main thing we need to do here is import the DOM repeat and iron selector. This is actually what's going to give us the ability to select our different tabs within our navigation, as well as, display the tabs. I've done some basic styling here. Nothing special, mostly just got them to line up side by side, did some basic coloring on selected and hover, and I'll go into details on all these colors here in a second whenever I take a look at our app theme. And if we go ahead and head down here, first thing I have to do is import the Firebase Auth so that we can track signed in status. That's really all I care about within this element. Later, I'm going to be adding some additional functionality for permissioning. So for example, if you log in as an admin, so myself on my portfolio website, you'll be able to navigate to creating a blog post instead of just viewing the blog post, just to simplify my life a little bit. But for now, we're just handling purely with sign-in. this is a little weird, and I'll get to this one first just because it popped out to me. So within the filter, normally you would pass a function that works the exact same as the ES6 syntax for filtering. However, in this case, can't quite do that, and the reason for that is normally the filter functionality will be called, the filter function will be called every time the items themselves change. In this case, I actually need to monitor for the status of signed in. And since that's not part of the items themselves, obviously that doesn't re-trigger the functionality. So to get around that, I created my filter pages as a function that takes the signed in. So it'll be recomputed every time signed in changes. And then down below, where it takes signed in, it returns the function you would expect for filtering. So this is where I handle my filter section. So if it doesn't have a label, or it doesn't have an attribute version of the label. The reason I handled this is because I want to be able to inject objects so that my routing for navigation can have more than just what's in my iron pages that we saw elsewhere. For this app, I don't plan on using that functionality. That's just something that is habitual to me. The next section is where I handle the sign-in logic. So if you're signed in or you're using an authenticated page, that this lookup has null because empty string is actually the truthy case for authenticated. So if you're trying to hit an authenticated page and you're not signed in, it'll fail that check. And then we just go ahead and set those up as an array, and I'm using an every, which is an ES6 function, to make sure that all of these are truthy. So if you're not signed in, you can't hit an authenticated page. And from our app pages, you saw that test element that I had injected with the flag authenticated on it, which will fall into this case here. So that one shouldn't show up unless we are signed in. And we'll see that functionality here in a second whenever I actually run this. For now, let's hop back up to the top section. So it's just standard iron selector. We're going to be selecting on the page, and I'll show you the where this is bound here in a second as well. Then we DOM repeat over all of the pages, and this is what's coming from the app pages, which was why we needed the two-way binding headed up. And then for each one, I'm still using the $= syntax. I don't think this is required anymore with Polymer 2. Again, this is just a habit from using Polymer 1 for so long. I'm using this get function to fetch everything, and I'll show you that one here in a second as well on why we need that instead of just using the normal page.name or page.label. Class for styling. This is the section that's a bit of an outlier. Normally, I would inject this through an object, but it gets kind of weird on that object injection for sign in, and it's only ever needed here anyways. If I have a side navigation, I don't want this. I just want this for the top navigation, so it's easier to handle this as an object being injected anyways. So if we're not signed in, show the sign in. If we're signed in, show sign out. This will get more complex as I add user profile and stuff like that to it, but for now it serves our purposes of allowing us to sign in and sign out. So if we hop down to our function down here, you'll see that we're passing in the page as well as pages and signed in, and we need to make sure that notify is being passed back up so that our bindings work outside of this element to actually navigate us around. Again, root path is being injected here, though I don't really have much of a need for it within this element right now. I could actually remove this in this case. Sign in, we're just going to call auth, sign in with pop-up. As you saw above in the auth, I'm using Firebase auth, and I'm specifically using just the Google for sign in. I don't really like using alternatives to it, especially for something as simplistic as what I'm going to be using here. But if you do need to use alternatives, you can use those as well by just offering the user to choose which one they want. And you can add different providers for each auth and call them from each function for each icon that you have set up. So next up is, again, we're just calling sign out. This stays the same no matter which provider you're using, so you wouldn't have to tweak that one. Skip down to the get functionality. So I mentioned above that this is needed, and the reason this is needed is because I want to be able to support objects or HTML elements. So by default, we're going to try and support the object. So we'll just do a path lookup on object, but if that fails, we're going to fall back to get attribute. You notice that this can be an issue for your number-based attributes. So for example, if object path is actually provided, but it's provided as 0, Obviously, that's going to fail and go into the get attribute case, which could be undefined. I'm not accounting for that here because I explicitly am never going to be using that. This is also a poor setup if you're using, like for example, up above where I'm using get attribute to check authenticated. In the case where it's a Boolean attribute authenticated, if this were authenticated, it would actually return false because it's an empty string. That's not exactly the functionality we would want for Boolean attributes, but again, I'm just using this for my lookups on my string attributes for like labels and name and stuff like that. Anywhere up above where I'm using that functionality to actually do Boolean checks on it, I'm going to be writing it out in the longhand for that. So that wraps up our elements. We're going to go ahead now and head over to our app shell, and that's going to be where we are implementing our elements. As you'll see here at the top, all I'm really doing from a Power Component standpoint is implementing our Firebase app. Again, this is purely because I'm using Firebase for my authentication, so I need to configure my app here at the top. Next, I'm going to import both of our elements and all of my themes because I'm using them all here, with the exception of buttons. And again, we'll go into details on the theming section here in a second. Again, I went ahead and dropped all of the theming from a layout standpoint, from like app header layout and app layout and all those things. So I've got some styles associated with creating those. I've all the colors from my colors theming. I still need to move over to all my padding into a separate theme file for that. But here we're just handling navigation, title, header, that kind of stuff. I go ahead and configure my Firebase app, which will go into details on how to do this in a later video. And then here's the bulk of the content for my application itself. Header, title, nav, and then content. All I have in this case is a fixed title across the header and the content, which you can navigate through the pages. I need to make sure that page is linked in both locations and defined as a property down below. And again, pages, but you'll notice that pages is a one-way binding for nav and a two-way binding for content. And this is because the app pages element is actually what's creating this set of pages that then the nav uses to repeat over and generate. And again, we're passing root path everywhere. That's pretty much the extent of it for our app shell. The whole purpose of this is to keep the app shell as light and easy to use as possible, since we don't want to be importing big blocks and chunks of code just to spin up the basic shell for our application. Next, we're going to go into details about the pages section. Right now I have three: our 404 page, a blog page, and a main page, which I'm currently using as my home page. For now, we're going to go ahead and focus on the main page. The other two for currently are identical. They're just some lorem ipsum with different definitions. The 404 page has a little bit of different content, but there's nothing special or new about those. So we're only going to go into details about the main page for now. In the future, I will have additional videos on especially the blog page, creating that, including subrouting, so that we can handle multiple pages within there, looking at individual blog posts versus the list of all of the blog posts, stuff like that. I haven't built that out, so it'll be in a later video. So just like any other element definition, we just need to import the Polymer element. In this case, we're using shared styles. That's what's giving us the definition for card and divider here. Like any other style module, we include it through the include statement on our style and give it a name. The naming syntax I use for all of my elements starts with the am dash prefix. Am is just what I'm using as the short name for my portfolio, which is my initials. It's a page, so it gets page dash inside of it, and then the name of the page. In this case, I'm using main. Elsewhere, I reference it as my home page. Not really important how I distinguish between that. I just know that my main page is the landing page for all the content on my website when you hit the slash or the root path URL. Everything else is pretty straightforward. I've just got some lorem ipsum. I'm drawing a card and it has divider under the header section, so under my H1. And then I just need to give it an is statement and create the instance of it as a definition. Like I said, I'll go into more details about additional structures for subrouting and stuff like that in a later video. all the pages that I have set up in this app are handled pretty much the exact same way, so there's no point in going into details about the others. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the last section I want to talk about in this video, which is the theme. The icons is just a normal icon set of any icons that are specific to this app. I like to go ahead and move the SVG codes for all icons I use into one centralized file. The reason for that is efficiency. I don't want to import the entirety of Iron icons just because I'm using one icon from it. So it just keeps the size of my bundles down as much as possible. Buttons is all of the stylings associated with my buttons, such as success and failure buttons, what buttons look like whenever they're disabled. All of that goes into one theming style sheet, so I can import just that as needed. Colors, which is the one what we're going to go over here, is just the colors for my app. And then shared styles is everything else that's shared across the pages. So for example, what a card looks like within my application as far as the drop shadow or the box shadow on it in the background and header and all that stuff. So we're going to go ahead and take a look at our style module for colors. Again, it's just set up like a normal style module. We give it a name, in this case colors, import a template containing a style. Everything I have in this one is declared in the host because it's just the colors for the entire application. And then I go ahead and break it down into the themes. So I have my primary colors, my text colors, my accent colors, and then I have divider colors. So this is going to be the theme for the entire application. You'll notice that I like to use on my shadows, so I have a divider shadow and an accent shadow. I actually use RGBA for these. I know some people prefer to break their shadows or however they handle their colors into the red, green, blue segments. So then they just do RGBA or RGB and wrap the different segments, and they can provide the changes to the opacity as needed in each section. I tend to prefer to keep it centralized and use it the exact same way in every case. Again, this is a pretty simple app, especially as far as theming goes, so I plan on using the same base theme as much as possible. Also because I haven't fully decided on what the theme to be. That's never been a strong point for me, so I'm relying more on this theme, the color theming module, and my layout, so that I can change that in one centralized location. So that covers everything I wanted to go over in this video. So now I'm just going to go ahead and talk through the changes as they show up visually. You can see based on these that I have my card sitting in the center with my accent box shadow around it. I'm also using that same accent box shadow around my name for in place of a logo. Again, this is all handled at the app level, from being able to scroll over and get the hover effects. But then over here, we're handling this within the nav element, which, like you saw before, is being generated by our pages. So we can toggle between pages, and because of the bindings that we're using, it'll actually change the page, and you'll see up in the URL, hopefully you can see, that it's actually changing the route of the app as well. So I'll go ahead and sign in. You can't see this, but it opened up another window for me, which is auto signing me in through Google. And once we're done signing in, you'll see that's actually going to switch the sign in to a sign out, and then adds our authenticated route. If we try and go to it, it's going to hit the 404 page because it can't import that route because we never set up any imports for it. This is explicitly what I expected here, because I am relying solely on lazy importing to import everything. You can change that logic within the pages if you want to only import for elements that don't contain definitions. So for example, if you inject a div like I did with authenticated on it and add some content inside of it, that element has a definition because a div will always have a definition, at which point you can go ahead and render that instead of attempting to lazy import. If you try and lazy import the same page multiple times, it won't make a difference because lazy imports will go ahead and already see that it's imported that previously and handle that for you. So there's no need to worry about checking definitions for it unless you have a use case that you want it to handle against. That pretty much wraps up everything that I wanted to talk about here. I'll be going into more details, like I said earlier, in Firebase in a later video on how to set up Firebase application as well as how to deploy the application. This is all running on Firebase now. I've actually got it set up to deploy already, and continuous integration and continuous deployment set up for that as well, which will also be in a later video. So, as always, if you have questions, you can find me on the Polymer Slack channel at a Murdoch, which I'll link in the description below. And go ahead and check out my previous video on deploying to S3, and I look forward to talking to you all. Thanks.